Well, I have good news. I have it on good authority. There'll be no masks in heaven. Over the past few weeks, we've been studying the story of Abram, or Abraham as he was later called, from the book of Genesis. And today is the last in our series on Abraham. I expected people to cheer. Must be tired of it. So we've been examining his call, his partial obedience, his indiscretions, and the results of his failure to completely obey God's call on his life. And last week, just to kind of refresh our minds, we saw that in order to resolve a dispute between himself and his nephew Lot, that he should have left behind in Haran, Abraham gives a good portion of the land, gives away a good portion of the land, and in fact, the best portion of the land. And it was land that God had specifically promised to Abraham and his seed. And as we pointed out, Lot was not his seed. So again, a conflict that developed between himself and Lot was the result of disobedience. And as a result, Abraham gives away a good portion of God's gift. You know, the story of Lot, if you look at it from beginning to the end, is really a sad one. Lot never really got away from the influence of sin and idolatry in his life. You know, it's possible that the reason that Abraham brought Lot along was he was hoping, when he was taking him away from the idolatry of Haran, perhaps he was hoping that Lot would somehow come to a relationship with God. But he never really got away from it. Apparently, he really never had the desire to make a clean break with the world around him. You know, there's lots of people that struggle with that when they come to the Lord today. They want the good things of salvation, but they're reluctant to make a clean break with where they've been and where they are and decide to walk purely after the Lord. You know, it's great. It's great to hear a story of someone that makes that kind of break. I remember a few years ago we went to visit some neighbors, and they didn't attend our church except on special occasions. And to be honest, they attended Chester Lake Camp when my son was speaking, so obviously they were more attracted to his ministry than mine, and that's okay. But as we sat in their home, and they're both deceased now, but an older couple, and they shared with me how a neighbor had come and witnessed to them and shared the gospel. And they also shared how their lives radically changed from that moment on. All of the old habits, all of the old associations were gone. And in an instant, God changed them in an amazing way. Now, that's not everybody's story. Sometimes other people struggle until they make that break. But the important thing is that that break is made, and Lot apparently never gets to that position. And as we wrapped up last week's study, we saw that Lot had settled near Sodom, near that sinful city and its wicked culture. And in Genesis chapter 13, verses 12 and 13, that's Genesis 13. And we're going to do a lot of reading this morning, and I'm going to try and do it quickly in the interest of time. So Abram settled in the land of Canaan, and Lot moved his tents to a place near Sodom and settled among the cities of the plain. But the people of this area were extremely wicked and constantly sinned against the Lord. So Lot continues to live in a questionable location, but at least the conflict between Abraham and Lot has been temporarily solved. But this decision to bring Lot was a decision that would continue to be a problem for Abraham. And as we will see a little later on this morning, not just a problem for Abraham, but a problem for succeeding generations. Now, we're going to just highlight some things here. I'm not going to read all the scriptures associated with them, so you're going to have to take my word for some of the highlights. that I want to bring to your attention. Time passes, but in Genesis chapter 14, we see that Lot's presence brings yet another problem to Abraham. A civil war breaks out in Lot's area, and Lot and his family are captured. And Abraham is forced to rally a small army to go and rescue them. So the problems continue. And by the time that we get to chapter 18 and 19, an interesting thing has happened. Lot and his family have now moved from not just being near the city into the city of Sodom. Interesting. First they were near the city, but now it appears they've moved right into the city. Interesting how an affection for a sinful lifestyle has the power to continue to entrap us and to draw us into more depravity. So important that we make those complete breaks from the sinful culture around us. God's anger is eventually kindled against the sin of the city, and Abraham finds himself pleading for God not to destroy the city. So Lot and his family are in jeopardy. Once again, Abraham has to get involved to plead with God not to destroy the city. Well, we know, I think all of us here this morning probably know the story. God allows Lot and his family to eventually escape, but his wife fails to make this clean break, and she dies during the escape. And sadly, the story of Lot does not end well. It ends very tragically. Eventually, and you can read this on your own, Lot would become the father of two sons through incestuous relationships with his two daughters. The oldest girl's son was called Moab, and the younger girl's son was named Ammon. And their children and grandchildren and extended descendants would become the idolatrous peoples called the Moabites and the Ammonites. They became two large, significant people groups who would continue to possess a part of the land that God had given to Abraham, but Lot had given away. And hundreds of years later, they would be a significant force to deal with when Joshua and the children of Israel returned from Egypt and through war would eventually retake the land promised to Abraham. So you see the long-term implication here of the indiscretion. Brings Lot continuing problems, incestuous relationship, idolatrous people groups, the land that was promised to Abraham given away. Multiple generations, hundreds of years later, the impact of the decision, and it could be argued, and perhaps I will argue a little bit later on, that the impact is still felt today in world affairs. Now our God is a forgiving God. The sacrifice of our Lord on Calvary's cross makes forgiveness possible regardless of what we have done. But the practical impact of our missteps, and we talked a little bit about this last week, can cause hurt not just in our present time, but in generations to follow. So while God's forgiveness is precious, prevention is even a simpler and better approach. Deal with sin at its first appearance, and thereby minimizing the present and future impact. As we closed last week's teaching, we contrasted the two men. Abraham with his desire to get back on track, to do that restart, to do that reboot, to get back on track with God's plan for his life, and his desire once again to be a worshiper. And then we contrasted that with Lot, whose heart was for material gain, for the land, to get away from God, to get away from his presence, and to be surrounded and immersed in the sinful lifestyle. Today we want to move on to chapters 15 and 16, and so we're going to begin to read at Genesis chapter 15, verse 1 to 7. Genesis 15, 1-7. Sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abraham in a vision and said to him, "Do not be afraid, Abraham, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great." But Abraham replied, "O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son?" Have you ever thought about this? Abraham forgets about all of the other blessings, or is willing to forget about all the other blessings because he hasn't received the one blessing that he really wants. Do you ever think about that in the context of our own lives? How many times God has blessed us in so many ways, particularly as Canadians. And yet, because God hasn't answered one specific prayer that tends to be right in our total focus, we tend to be forgetful and not be thankful because we haven't got the one thing that we really think we need from God. "Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir." And then the Lord said to him, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir." A very definite and specific promise that he hears from the Lord. And then the Lord took Abraham outside and said to him, "Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have." And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. At this moment, he's got great faith. He's just heard from God. He's believing that God is going to deliver on his promise. And as we look back on this now, thousands of years later, we see that eventually God did fulfill his promise to Abraham. The Jewish nation is still alive and well. Millions of Jewish people still living in the world. Now, there's no doubt that the promise to Abram requires a substantial amount of faith, a huge amount of faith, a gigantic amount of faith. He and his wife are advanced in years, and several years have passed since God first called them out of Haran. It's a huge faith requirement. And so it's quite understandable that since nothing seems to be happening, that doubts would begin to creep into their thinking. Perhaps Abraham begins to think that he didn't completely understand God's plan. Perhaps God meant that he would inherit the land through the servant and not through his own children. But God reassures Abraham that his promise is still valid. Let's look at 5 and 6. Then the Lord took Abraham outside and said to him, "Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have." And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. An affirmation at that point that he is agreeing with God's promise. And God goes on in the remainder of that chapter to reveal to Abraham events that would transpire hundreds of years later into the future. Abraham here is given a prophetic picture of the Egyptian captivity that would eventually be the future of his descendants and would last 400 years. God gives him insight into the future and what's going to happen. Now, one would think that such an amazing visitation from God would permanently erase any doubts. Indeed, the word clearly says that at that point Abraham believed God for everything that he said. But the promise is gigantic. Its fulfillment requires a huge miracle. And by the opening of chapter 16, Abraham and Sarah have once again succumbed to doubts. Not sure exactly how many years have gone by in this period, but we read there, "Now Sarah, Abraham's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarah said to Abram, 'The Lord has prevented me from having children.'" Notice the reversal here from belief to a decision that is starting to blame God. God promised us a child, but now he's preventing us from having children. Go and sleep with my servant, perhaps I can have children through her. And Abram agreed with Sarah's proposal. So Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, gave her to Abram as a wife. And this happened 10 years after Abraham settled in the land of Canaan. So Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress, Sarah, with contempt. And then Sarah said to Abraham, "This is all your fault." That's interesting. Little family spat going on here. "I put my servant into your arms, and now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me." Abraham replied, "Look, she's your servant, so deal with her as you see fit." And then Sarah treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness, along the road to Shur. And that spring was so abundant it became known as the Sure Thing. The angel said to her, "Hagar, Sarah's servant, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarah," she said. Now it's intriguing that the Muslims clearly believe that Hagar's spring is still in existence. And it is in existence near Mecca, where every Muslim is expected to make a pilgrimage. And one of the things that is part of the pilgrimage for many people is that they will bring a jug or jugs of plastic material, whatever, on the airplane or the ship or however they get to Saudi Arabia, and they will fill those jugs from Hagar's spring, believing that they have miraculous virtue. So this story of Abraham is alive today in many aspects. Hagar's spring, you know, whether it's exactly the same spring or not, we don't really know. The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her authority." And then he added, "I will give you more descendants than you count." This is the promise now not to Abraham, but the promise to Hagar that she would have more descendants than she could count. And, as we will see a little bit later, we, again, in our world, have seen the fulfillment of this promise to Hagar. The angel also said, "You are now pregnant and will give birth to a son, and you are going to name him Ishmael," which means God hears. God heard Hagar's prayer. "For the Lord has heard your cry of distress." Now I want you to note the character that's portrayed as being part of Hagar's son. "This son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives." Thereafter, Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her. She said, "You are the God who sees me." She also said, "Have I truly seen the one who sees me?" So that well was named Beer-lahai-roi, which means well of the living one who sees me. It can still be found between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave Abram a son, and Abram named him Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Now there's several reasons why this chapter is interesting. First, this arrangement, this addition of a second partner to propagate the family was not a unique situation in that world to Abram and Sarah. Other couples in that period of history which concluded that they could not otherwise have children would follow a similar plan. Sarah's suggestion that Abram would have children through her servant may seem very strange to us. However, it didn't seem that strange to Abraham and Sarah because it was a common solution to infertility in the ancient Near East. According to an Assyrian marriage document from the 19th century BC, if the bride could not provide her husband with offspring, she had to purchase a slave woman for childbearing. An Akkadian tablet from the 15th century BC lists a similar requirement, adding that the children of the slave woman must be given the inheritance and not be sent away. And also throughout the Old Testament we see the practice of multiple wives. And the word that we have just read here, and you can go back and check the wording exactly, the word says clearly that Abraham, at the suggestion of Sarah, takes the servant into his home as a wife. So presumably Abraham and Sarah's doubts give way to thinking that perhaps they were not doing their part. They began to think about what others are doing in that particular society and in that particular culture. And eventually they apparently convinced themselves that since there's no apparent solution of a miracle, they would take action themselves. And so here we have a very important point that we should learn from the story, and it is this. Deciding what is appropriate for you and I to do as followers of Christ should never be based on what is acceptable in our culture or even what others who call themselves Christians are doing. Our relationship is not with other believers. It is in one sense, but not in the sense of governing our action. Our relationship is with the Lord, and our Lord has spoken through His Word, and our lifestyle needs to be governed based on what we read in His Word. Most of you here today have had experience as parents. You will know that the common pushback when you are trying to teach and coach your children to live in godly ways, you often hear this statement, well, Mom, well, Dad, everyone else is doing it. How many have heard that? How many said that? Yeah, we know what else. And so this kind of rationalization works its way into our lives as adults. But God calls us to live in alignment with His principles and His ways. And when we adopt what everyone else is doing as justification for our actions, we fall away from God's plan and purposes for our lives. Secondly, their actions essentially were the consequence of faith giving way to doubt, and doubt eventually eroding to actions which abandon their faith in God to keep His promises in their lives. So we learn from this. If God has spoken to you, if God is calling you in a certain direction, stick with God's plan to deliver on His promises and His ability to lead you through the personal plans He has for your life. Think about the promise He made to Abraham. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars of the sky. We see that fulfillment today. Think about the promise made to Hagar that Ishmael's descendants would be so numerous they couldn't count. Look around today. Promise fulfilled. Thirdly, let's examine the implications and fallout from their actions. As we mentioned before, the word clearly says that Hagar was taken in as a wife. This has significant meaning. It means that Ishmael was a legitimate heir in terms of how that culture viewed things. Who was to receive the major part of the inheritance in Old Testament culture? The eldest son. Ishmael is older than Isaac. And this point continues to be made to this very day when Muslims, for example, discuss who has the legal right to Abraham's estate. Remember, Abraham's estate was the land of Palestine. We call it Palestine today. And Abraham and Sarah's decision here to step out of God's plan has implications to this very day. Is there any piece of property in the world that is more seriously contended over than the Middle East? Right? It continues to this day. Fourthly, as per the word, Hagar was an Egyptian believed to be one of the servants provided by Pharaoh. Remember, Abraham travels down into Egypt. When he leaves, Pharaoh gives all kinds of cattle, resources, and servants. And essentially then, this woman was available as a result of Abraham's mistake to leave Canaan, where he was called to be, and instead migrate to Egypt. Ishmael would eventually become the father of 12 sons, and they and their descendants would become the father of the Arab nations that inhabit the Middle East and North Africa to this very day. After roaming the wilderness for some time, Ishmael and his mother settled in the desert of Paran, where he became an expert in archery, and eventually his mother found him a wife from the land of Egypt. And they had 12 sons who became tribal chiefs throughout the regions from Assyria to the border of Egypt and that whole area of the Middle East. Now there's some interesting things that we know or are led to believe from sources that are outside of the scriptures. Interesting things about a couple of his sons. His second son was named Kedar. He was father of the Kedarites, a northern Arab tribe that controlled the area between the Persian Gulf and the Sinai Peninsula. According to Islamic tradition, he is the ancestor of the Quraysh tribe, and thus the ancestor of Muhammad, who launched the Islamic faith. Implications of Abraham's day impacting on us today. Third son, Abil, established a tribe in northwest Arabia. Duma, associated with Adumatu, is described as a fortress in Arabia and Saudi Arabia. And Massa, father of a nomadic tribe that inhabited the Arabian desert toward Babylonia. So here's the point that I would like to leave with you today. Does walking away from God's plan for your life have serious consequences? Does partial obedience, does indiscretion, does sin have far-reaching implications? You bet it does. We have already seen that Lot's descendants became a big problem for the Israelites in their retaking the land promised to Abraham. Where is one of the most hot spots, so to speak, in the world today? The Middle East, right? Hardly a month goes by but what we hear of conflict in the Middle East. Remember how the prediction was that Ishmael's sons, his descendants, would be at war with his brethren? Well, Jews, Arabs, constantly at one another's throats. Prophecy fulfilled. From where did Al-Qaeda emerge? From the Middle East, from the Arab nations. The struggle and wars for the land promised to Abraham continue to rage between the descendants of Isaac and the descendants of Ishmael to this very day. As we know, the church and the gospel in many parts of the world are under severe persecution from Islamic radicals in many parts of the world as we speak. A friend of mine who I worked with in a couple of organizations in the past was recently in an African nation rather, and teaching to believers whose area once had no mosques, but now have mosques, it seems, on every corner. Radicals in operation, people being kidnapped, people being tortured, people dying. Does walking away from God's plan for your life have serious consequences? You bet it does. It did for Abraham, and it does for us. Lord, thank you for your Old Testament word, which doesn't hide truth, doesn't try to keep the weaknesses of Old Testament patriarchs hidden from our view. Help us to learn from them, Lord. Help us to see these accounts as teachable moments in our lives. Help us not to be like Lot and try and live close to the world and then become contaminated by it and its values to the destruction of your word and your values in our lives. Help us to walk in the path you've called us to. Help us to believe that the promises you've made you will fulfill. Thank you, Lord. We bless your holy name.